We all know that we live in a world where stigma against sexual and gender minorities still prevails. But it doesn't have to be this way. In India, between 2014 and 2019, support for homosexuality jumped from 15% to 37%. That's in only 5 years. In Kenya, positive attitudes towards same-sex relationships rose in the 21st century from 1% to 14%. Some might say it's a small step, but it's in the right direction, and the first step is often the toughest. In the USA, 60% of people were opposed to same-sex marriage in 2004. In 2019, it was exactly the opposite, and now a majority of conservatives even support it. In Argentina, a whopping 83% of people support the right of trans people to get their gender recognized officially. So yes, attitudes can change, even in countries where the legal and social environments are very challenging. Unfortunately, they can change in both directions, and our opponents are working hard everywhere to block new gains and even roll back the ones we fought for. It's more critical now than ever before that we stand our ground and fight back. And this requires good public advocacy strategies. Of course, these strategies depend on each specific situation, but there are a few things which might be quite similar across contexts. For example, we often hear that the objective of a campaign is to raise awareness with the general public. Well, listen to this.
In a fairy tale world, this is what campaigning looks like. You meet with a few friends and have a lot of fun finding one really good campaign message that all of you like. You quickly find a perfect image to go with it. You post all of this on your Facebook page. You immediately get millions of views and everybody shares it. Overnight, all your worst enemies rush in to apologize for their past stupidly bad attitudes, pledging eternal love and support in the future. Okay, back to reality. Consider this. You're gathered at a family dinner and you want to make the case for marriage equality. You look around you and meet eyes with your geeky teenage nephew, your super religious great aunt, your sweet sister. Not the right moment, right? Well, the obvious thing here is that you just can't talk to everybody at once. Some people will be easy to persuade, others not. Trying to kill two birds with one stone only works in a metaphor. In real life, every bird needs its own stone. By the way, we are against killing birds. So, a campaigner's first task is to identify who to target. You can choose to go for the easy one, your sweet sister. She's likely to support you. That'll make you feel better and encourage you to aim higher. But maybe not auntie, right? In campaigning, some people are a lost cause, at least for now.
So, when you do public advocacy, the first question is to know who you are addressing and why. And for different targets, you must have different strategies. The more you focus, the more effective your advocacy. There are many other lessons that have been learned by campaigners across the world. For example, sometimes your issue is best addressed when it is connected to other issues to which people already relate. Let's look at how this was implemented in Ukraine.
Most often, when activists tackle discrimination, we only focus on a single issue, like racism or sexism, or homophobia, transphobia, ageism, or ableism. This can be effective, but it also has some limitations. One limitation is that no one has just one social identity. Some people are women, some people are men. Some people express their gender in a way that doesn't fit into either box. Some people are ethnic minorities, some people are young, some old, some disabled, some queer. All of us are actually many of these identities, together. An intersectional approach deliberately seeks to integrate different social identities and forms of discrimination under a more inclusive message. Inside Ukraine is an organization working for lesbians and bisexual women, transgender, queer, and intersex people. They have been looking at the intersections of social identities in Ukraine and seeing the way in which racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, ableism, and many other forms of oppression of minority groups have similar causes and work in similar ways. So, rather than starting to campaign against homophobia or transphobia, Insight launched a striking visual poster campaign that graphically showed the kind of hate speech women, LGBT and gender not-conforming people and ethnic minorities experience every day. By tackling these three together, the effect was to show how sexism and misogyny, homophobia and transphobia, and racism are connected, and to invite people to have a similar stance towards all three. The campaign soon went viral. More than 20,000 users saw the images, and over 10,000 people read at least one article about the campaign. For Insight, the campaign demonstrated that by looking at the more general issue of stigma through an intersectional lens, many more people were engaged than if they had only focused on homophobia and transphobia. But this approach was not just a clever way to get anti-racist and anti-sexist people to embrace the fight against homophobia. By showing the connection and pointing to the root causes, this campaign built long-lasting connections and alliances between several social movements. Feminist and anti-racist movements were not only more receptive to the issue of homophobia, they saw that their struggles were understood in their communities as well.
Interesting, isn't it? But intersectional approaches don't come without challenges and are not always adapted. They require a lot of careful connections to other progressive movements, which make public advocacy more difficult. One thing that is often true everywhere is that it is easier to convince and mobilize people along references that make sense to them, rather than relate to what is happening somewhere else. Look at this example from Nepal.
For most of us, the laws in our country by and large reflect the state of public opinion. When a good proportion of people support a more progressive vision, the laws gradually change to reflect this. This is why most activists engage in lobbying and campaigning. In some cases though, the law just won't move, even when public opinion had changed. This happens when very conservative governments are in power. But in some beautiful rare cases, the law jumps ahead of public opinion and shows what progress looks like. This is what happened in Nepal, thanks to years of strategic and clever activism by the Blue Diamond Society, Nepal's leading organization working for gays, lesbians, and third-gender people, as Nepal traditionally calls transgender people. As a result, in 2015, Nepal became the world's 10th country to specifically name LGBT people as a protected category in its new constitution, and a third gender category now officially coexist with male and female gender markers. Obviously, this is a good reason to celebrate, but the fight is not over. While in Kathmandu, progressive people were increasingly supporting sexual and gender diversities, in other parts of the country, traditional circles were frowning upon these evolutions, seen as imported from the decadent West. Nepal had never been colonized, and it wasn't to start now. Opposition started to mount, like dark clouds coming in. But the Blue Diamond Society was not an agent of anyone. The diamond had been formed within Nepal's age-old mountains, hills, rivers, and people. So when the Blue Diamond Society decided to start pride marches in Nepal, it very naturally didn't turn towards New York or London for inspiration. It looked inward to Nepalese culture. The Festival of Gaijatra is one of the oldest and most unusual of many festivals celebrated by the Hindus and Buddhists. Over the centuries, the festival developed a second purpose. In the days when political expression of any kind was outlawed, Gaijatra was the day when ordinary citizens could vent their frustrations through political and social satire without fear of reprisal from the rulers. Given this history, Gaijatra was the perfect time for a joyful protest march. Leading the march, riding on an elephant in rainbow colors, was just one of the many genius ideas that got the Pride March radically enshrined in local culture.
But again, this approach opens up interesting debates. For example, whether this national framing doesn't incidentally reinforce the narrative that what comes from foreigners is dangerous and has to be rejected. This narrative, at the end of the day, would reinforce conservative trends. One thing in public advocacy to always remember is that people are not convinced by you, but by people they can easily relate to, by people who they meet every day or people who they identify with. This lesson was nicely put into practice in Costa Rica.
Gia, in 2018, the Supreme Court of Costa Rica ruled that same-sex couples would be able to marry. Great, well done. So, why on earth did you launch a campaign after the victory?
Hey Chico, do you think it's that simple? You get a law passed after a court decision and you think everybody will just say, okay, cool, yeah. The presidential election that took place just before the court ruling had been ugly. The issue of same-sex marriage literally divided the country and almost got a harsh conservative elected. It was a close shot.
So, you mean you had to convince people that they should accept this court ruling?
You've said it. Accept. We knew there were a lot of people out there who were not happy.
Who were they? How did you know?
But we did conduct some research. You know, without research, you really are just living on assumption, and that's a huge mistake. So we found out through research that men over the age of 40 were the hardest to convince.
And how did you manage to talk to them?
We made sure that the people who talked to this audience were people that they could relate to, identify with, and respect. So we had a team of rugby players, really nice traditional parents, understanding fathers, supportive people from the village.
And what was that message that managed to convince these men?
Still through research, we found out that some of the key common values for Costa Ricans are respect, justice, and family. So we showed a lot of accepting families where family love is stronger than stigma. Again, the core focus was on acceptance. So the campaign slogan naturally became Yo sí acepto, I do accept. We got some really beautiful videos made. I hope you'll watch them after our talk. They are really moving.
And what about the opponents? How did you deal with them?
You know, sometimes you have to just forget about them. Even if Jesus himself came down and told them to stop doubting, they still wouldn't listen. We tried to avoid them as much as we could.
So, these are a few thoughts on public advocacy. As we said before, each context is different, so public advocacy strategies have to rest on solid evidence, on social psychology, target audience research, narrative testing, and much more. A fascinating and challenging arena to enter so that progress keeps going the right way.